There is a moment, in a dim room in a town you've never heard of, that this man had spent 19 years making certain would never come. For 19 years, he had been no one. A dozen names. A dozen towns. A dozen graves robbed for a name to wear for a season and then leave behind. He had never been caught. He had never, not once, been afraid. And then a woman he had chosen. Carefully, the way he chose all of them. A woman he was certain was the easiest mark of his entire life, leaned across a table and said 5 quiet words. 5 words he had not heard spoken aloud since 1985. And as she said them, the color went out of his face, because those 5 words were the one thing in the world he could not run from, could not buy off, could not talk his way around. But we're not going to tell you what they were. Not yet. Because to understand how the man who fooled an entire country finally met the one person on earth he should have been terrified of, we have to go back to the day he believed he had found his easiest victim yet. And before we go back, do 2 small things for me. First, tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And second, if you're the kind of person who can't look away from a story like this, hit subscribe. It's free, it helps more than you know, and it's how these stories find the people who need them. Now, let's meet the woman who was already waiting for him. If you know this man, you already know how he works. He finds a town the world has forgotten. He restores one beautiful thing it has lost to buy its faith. He offers its people a share in their own comeback. And then, over a single weekend, he and their money vanish, under a name he borrowed from a dead stranger. He had done it again, and again, and again. Different name, different grave, different town, always the same ending. He was, by any measure, the most successful con man no one had ever heard of, because the ones who could have named him never knew his name to begin with. This is the story of the one time it went differently. And it comes down to 3 questions. Who was the woman who finally stopped him? How did she know what no police force in 3 states had been able to learn? And what did she do to him that the law never could? He had spent 19 years being impossible to find. It never once occurred to him that somewhere, someone had spent those very same 19 years refusing to stop looking. By the autumn of 2004, the man was at the height of his powers. The last job, a steel town in Ohio called Halford, had gone perfectly. He had taken a town's savings, a woman's heart, and $4 million, and he had driven away clean, the way he always did. If you saw the last story, you remember her. Her name was Claire. Remember her. She matters more to this one than you can yet imagine. And success, for a man like this, is a quiet kind of poison. 19 years without being caught had taught him the most dangerous lesson a predator can learn, that he was untouchable. He had stopped double-checking. He had started moving faster. He had begun to believe his own performance. Which is to say, by 2004, the man was overdue to make a mistake. He simply could not imagine what it would look like. Because it was going to look like a kind, lonely widow offering him a slice of pie. The town was called Hadley, North Carolina. A lake town that the tourists had loved, once, and then forgotten the way people forget a song. The boats had stopped coming. The young had moved on. The grand old dance pavilion on the water had been dark for 15 years. Hadley was exactly the kind of place that had stopped believing anything good would ever happen to it again. Which is to say, it was exactly the kind of place he was looking for. A town that was hungry. A town that wanted, more than anything, to be saved. He had a finely tuned instinct for desperation. He pulled into Hadley, looked at the dark pavilion on the water, and he smiled. And then he went looking for the one thing every job needed. The most trusted, loneliest person in town. He found her almost at once. Her name was Vivian Cross. 56 years old. A widow, the town said. She'd lost her husband some years back and moved to Hadley quietly, the way grieving people sometimes do, to a place where no one knew them before. She ran a small antique shop near the water. She was kind. She was composed. She kept to herself. And she was, by every signal the man had spent 19 years learning to read, completely, perfectly alone. He did what he always did. He watched her for days. He learned her routine. He learned that she had no children nearby, no crowd of friends, no one who would ask too many questions. He learned that the town respected her, that if Vivian Cross trusted a man, Hadley would trust him too. She was, he concluded, the easiest mark he had ever found. He was so pleased with himself that he never stopped to ask the only question that mattered. Why would a careful, intelligent woman move alone, in late middle age, to a dying lake town in the middle of nowhere, and wait. On a gray Tuesday afternoon, he walked into her shop, and he gave her the smile. The one that had emptied a dozen towns. And here is the first thing. The small thing you would only notice if you were looking very, very closely. For half a second, Vivian Cross did not smile back. For half a second, she looked at him the way you look at a face you have been studying for a very long time. And then, right on cue, the warmth came into her eyes, and she smiled, and she asked if he'd like some coffee. And he, delighted, certain, walking straight into the only mistake of his life, said, "Please. And thank you." That night, after she locked the shop, Vivian Cross did something she did every night. She went to the back room, the one she kept locked, the one even her few friends in Hadley had never seen inside. And to understand what was in that room is to understand that the man asleep in his rented house on the hill had not found a victim at all. He had walked, smiling, into a trap that had been 19 years in the making. He ran the same play he had run 9 times before. He told the people of Hadley that he had seen towns like theirs die, and that he refused to let it happen here. He would reopen the old dance pavilion on the water. He would bring back the boats, the music, the tourists. He would give Hadley its summers back. And, just as he had in Halford, and in Indiana, and in Pennsylvania, he offered them a way to belong to their own rescue. Founding shares. A chance to put a little money into the comeback now, and to be repaid many times over when the lake came back to life. It was the same script, word for word. He had stopped writing new ones years ago. Why would he? It had never once failed. And it worked here the way it always worked, not because of him, but because of her. Because sitting in the second row, nodding, smiling, was Vivian Cross, the most trusted woman in Hadley. And when Vivian seemed to believe, the town believed. He gave them their proof, the way he always did. He paid, out of his own pocket, to begin restoring the pavilion. Within weeks, there were lights on the water again for the first time in 15 years. Hadley wept the way Halford had wept. The man knew exactly what he was doing. He had learned, long ago, that you do not sell people a promise. You sell them one beautiful, true thing, and then you let their hope do the rest. And he courted Vivian Cross the way he had courted all of them. Slowly, patiently, he remembered the things she said. He asked about her late husband, and listened like the answer was the only thing in the world. By the time the leaves turned, the whole town was certain. The stranger who was saving Hadley was going to marry the woman who ran the antique shop by the water. He proposed. She said yes. And if you have heard this story before, if you watched a woman named Claire say yes under a marquee in Ohio, then right now your heart is sinking, because you think you know exactly where this is going. You don't. Because there were moments, small ones, when the man's instincts, the ones that had kept him free for 19 years, flickered. Once, he came into the back of the shop a moment earlier than she expected, and caught her writing something in a small notebook, which she closed a little too quickly. She told him it was the day's receipts. He smiled and believed her. He should not have believed her. And once, just once, late at night, the thought arrived unbidden, the way it never had before. Why is this one so easy? Every other town, there had been at least one skeptic. A journalist. A contractor. A sister-in-law who didn't like his smile. In Hadley, there was no one. Every door opened before he reached it. Every question answered itself. For a man who had survived by being suspicious of everything, the total absence of friction should have been the loudest alarm of his life. But Vivian Cross was very, very good. Better than he was. And every time that flicker rose in him, she was ready, with a laugh, a touch, a story about her late husband that made him feel, for a moment, like the safest man in the world. So he ignored the alarm. He buried it under his own certainty. And he kept walking toward the trap. And every night, after he kissed her goodnight and drove back up the hill, Vivian Cross returned to the locked room at the back of her shop. Tonight, we go in with her. The walls were covered in him. Photographs. A man who was never photographed. Pulled from the corners of 9 towns over 19 years. Newspaper clippings, including a yellowed front page from a little Ohio weekly called the Halford Courier, written by a journalist named Marion Pratt. A map of the country, stuck with pins. And a list of names, his borrowed names, with 3 of them crossed out in red. Vivian Cross was not falling for anything. Vivian Cross had not moved to Hadley by accident. She had moved there because she knew, somehow, that he was coming. The lonely widow with the easy smile was the most prepared adversary the man had ever met in his life. And he had just asked her to marry him. Now look again at everything you just watched, and understand that every soft, trusting, foolish thing Vivian Cross did was a move on a board he couldn't see. But to understand the board, you have to understand that Vivian Cross was not playing alone. Over the years, she had done something no police department had ever managed. She had found the others. The women he had used and discarded, town by town, to unlock each place he robbed. In Pennsylvania, a widow named Pearl, who had run a flower shop and lost everything. In Indiana, a schoolteacher named Diane, who had never stopped wondering whether any of it was real. And in Halford, Ohio, a woman who ran a diner called the Bluebird. When Vivian Cross called her and said, "I found him, and I'm going to need your help," Claire Donnelly said yes before Vivian had even finished the sentence. For 19 years, this man's greatest weapon had been the thing he did to women like them. He found the loneliest, most trusted woman in a dying town, made her love him, and used her trust as a key. He had always assumed those women would stay where he left them, broken, ashamed, alone. He never once imagined that one day they would find each other, that the very thing he used to commit his crimes would become the thing that ended him. But the heart of the trap was Vivian herself. Because the story Hadley believed about her, quiet widow, little antique shop, was, like everything else, a costume. Before she came to Hadley, before she lost her husband, Vivian Cross had been a forensic accountant. She had spent a career following dirty money through the kinds of shell companies the man used to make $4 million disappear. She did not need the police to trace him. She could do it in her sleep. She had been doing it for 19 years. So here is what the man never understood about Hadley. The money he was so carefully preparing to steal, the founding shares, the town's investment, the $4 million he believed he was about to make vanish. Vivian Cross had quietly structured all of it herself. Every dollar was marked. Every account it would pass through was an account she controlled. The trail he thought he was erasing was, in truth, a confession he was signing in his own hand, one wire at a time. And the engagement, the ring, the wedding the whole town was planning? That was the final piece. Because the moment Vivian Cross became his fiancée, she became, on paper, a signatory to the very accounts he was using. She gave him the keys to the town. And in doing it, she put her own hand on the trapdoor beneath his feet. Every naive, trusting, lonely thing she had done was a lock clicking shut. He just couldn't hear them. But he was not a fool. He had survived 19 years on instinct, and 3 weeks before the end, the instinct finally screamed loud enough to hear. A number didn't sit right. An account he didn't remember opening. And then, the thing that nearly ended it all, a face. One afternoon, from his window, he saw a woman walking down Hadley's main street. Tired, kind-faced. The owner of a diner 2 states away. Claire Donnelly, come to help, who had let herself be seen for one careless second. And something in the man went cold. He didn't place her, but his body remembered her the way a man remembers a sound in the dark. That night, he began, quietly, to plan to run. Early, before the wedding, before whatever was wrong could find its shape. And Vivian Cross, who had spent 19 years preparing for this man, now faced the single hardest moment of the entire plan. She had to look at the human lie detector across the table, the man who had read 100 people perfectly, and convince him, completely, that she loved him, that nothing was wrong, that there was nowhere safer in the world than Hadley. We will never fully know what it cost her to do it. To smile at the man who had taken her entire life from her, and make him believe she adored him. But she did it. She was better than he was. The cold in him thawed, just enough. He decided he was being paranoid. He decided to stay, just a little longer. But only a little. Because even calmed, even reassured, the instinct had left its mark. He moved up his timeline. He decided he would not wait for the wedding after all. He would take the money this weekend, drain the accounts, scrub the house, and be 3 states gone by Monday, the way he always was. And that decision turned 19 years of patience into a race. Because Vivian's trap was not yet finished. The final accounts weren't armed. The others weren't all in place. She had built a perfect cage, plank by plank, over 19 years, and now she had 36 hours to close the last door of it, or watch the man she had given her whole life to catching vanish for a 10th time. And a final one, To understand why Vivian Cross had given 19 years of her life to catching this man, you have to go back further than Halford, further than any of the towns. You have to go back to 1985, to a real company, in a real city, long before the first borrowed name. If you saw the last story, you may remember one true thread the investigators found at the very end. That before he became a ghost, the man had once worked at an actual development company, a real one, that promised to revive struggling towns, took its investors' money, and collapsed, leaving those towns with nothing. He had learned the con, it was said, by being part of one that was legal. But the investigators never learned the rest. They never learned that the young man at that company had not simply watched the fraud. He had built it. He was its architect. And when it finally collapsed, when the law came looking for someone to blame, he did the thing he would spend the next 2 decades perfecting. He vanished. And he made certain that someone else was left holding everything. That someone was a young accountant who had trusted him, who had loved him, even. Her name was Vivian Cross. She lost her career. She lost her name. Fraud. The papers called her. She lost her marriage, her future, very nearly her freedom. And the man who had done it to her was simply gone. No forwarding address. No real name on any document. As if he had never existed at all. She spent years climbing out of the hole he'd left her in. And somewhere down in that hole, she made a decision that would organize the rest of her life. She was an accountant. She knew how to follow money, and she knew how to follow a pattern. And she was the only person on the face of the earth who knew the one thing he had erased most carefully of all. She knew his real name, the name he was born with, the name he buried in 1985 to become a string of dead men. And she swore that one day, she would make him answer to it. So watch it all again, now, with open eyes. The half-second she didn't smile when he walked into her shop. That was a woman finally seeing, in the flesh, the face she had hunted for 19 years. The notebook she closed too quickly, evidence. The fortune she invested, bait she controlled. The proposal she accepted, the legal key that put her hand on the trapdoor. There was never a single moment, from the first slice of pie, when Vivian Cross was not 3 moves ahead of him. He thought he had found the loneliest woman in Hadley. He had found the patient one. And now, with the man's timeline suddenly moved up, all of it came down to 36 hours. While he made his quiet arrangements to disappear, the others came to Hadley in the dark. Claire from Ohio, Diane from Indiana, Pearl from Pennsylvania, and a journalist named Marion Pratt, with a notebook and a recorder, because someone had to write down what was finally about to be true. Vivian armed the last of the accounts. She set the final lock. He thought he was about to disappear with $4 million. He was about to walk into the one trap he could never talk his way out of, because it had not been built by the law, and it could not be bribed, or charmed, or outrun. It had been built, plank by patient plank, by every single person he had ever lied to. He did it the way he had done it 9 times before, and it was, as always, flawless. Over a single weekend, he moved every dollar out of the Hadley renewal accounts. He scrubbed the rented house until it held no trace of him. He left one detail behind, the way he always did. A single chair, knocked over in an empty room, his only signature. By Sunday night he was packed, calm, and certain. He had won again. And then, one by one, the locks he could not hear began to turn. The money he had moved did not vanish. It settled, instead, into accounts that were frozen the moment it arrived. Every dollar tagged. Every transfer a sentence in a confession written in his own hand. The trail he believed he had erased lit up like a runway. And when he walked out to his car that night, to drive away clean for the 10th time, they were there. Not the police, not yet. Them, the women, standing in the dark beside his car, in a loose half-circle, saying nothing. Claire, whom he had left holding empty hangers in Ohio. Diane, Pearl, a journalist with a recorder running. And in the center, the woman he had asked to marry him. And in that moment, all at once, the man understood the thing that had been nagging at him for weeks. Why Hadley had been so easy. Why every door had opened before he reached it. Every easy thing in that town had been handed to him. He had not been hunting. He had been herded. He looked at Vivian Cross, and here is the cruelest, most perfect detail of all. He did not know her. 19 years, and a life rebuilt from nothing, had changed her enough that the man who never forgot a face could not place hers. He searched her eyes for a threat, for the law, for an angle he could work. He found none. He had no idea who she was. And Vivian Cross leaned across the space between them. The way she had leaned across 100 tables. The way you saw her lean in the very first moment of this story. And she said 5 quiet words. The 5 words he had not heard spoken aloud since 1985. She said, "Hello, Curtis. I found you." Curtis. His name. His real, born name. The one he had buried under a dozen graves. The one thing he had guarded more carefully than any amount of money. For 19 years, being no one had been his armor. It was the thing that made him untouchable. You cannot catch a man who does not exist. And in 3 words and a name, the woman he'd marked as his easiest victim took the armor off him in front of everyone and made him exist again. He had prepared for everything. Police, he could outrun. Evidence, he could outtalk. Suspicion, he could charm. He had a plan for every single thing that had ever threatened him in 19 years, except one. The one variable a ghost can never plan for. A witness from before the ghost. Someone who knew him when the money went back. All of it, traced, frozen, returned. To Hadley. To Pearl. To Diane. To Claire, who reopened the Bluebird with the savings she thought she'd lost forever. And the man, Curtis, was handed to the authorities at last with the one thing he had spent his whole life running from attached to him. A name. It could not give them back the years. It could not unbreak what he had broken. But for the first time, in the story of this man, it was the women who walked away into the morning together, and the man who was left standing in an empty room, with a knocked-over chair and nothing. Some stories never leave. But every now and then, the people in them get to decide how they end. So let me ask you, he fooled a dozen towns, because every single one of them wanted to believe him. Be honest, sitting in that diner, hearing about the man who'd come to save your town, are you sure you wouldn't have believed him too? Tell me down in the comments. And let me know where you're watching from. And there's one more thing. Vivian Cross got her name back, and her justice, and she gave the others theirs. But she never told them everything. There was one secret she kept to the very end. One last reason she hunted him that none of the other women ever knew. And that is the next story. If you want it the moment it drops, subscribe. It's free, and it's how these stories find the people who need them. This was Nimera. Some stories never leave.